Once upon a time. Such an iconic phrase, and one that we recognise around the world, because we know that when we hear that phrase, we're probably going to get a fairy tale. Now, I have to say, I absolutely love fairy tales, and I have since I was kind of knee-high to a grasshopper. But I still believe that they're relevant even now, today, as adults. I think the symbolism within them, the themes and the archetypes, we can work with these things to manifest positive change. Now, it's interesting because the Victorians called fairy tales wonder tales, and I think that's the perfect title for them. Yes, they can be dark, they can be grim, they can even be quite gruesome, but they do have elements of wonder and magic, and I think that describes them perfectly. Now, I have to say, if you are going to work with fairy tales, it doesn't necessarily mean that your life will be one big wonderful fairy tale. There will be highs and lows and challenges, as there are in any good story. I want to tell you a little bit about my fairy tale journey in the creation of this book, because it was a bit of a journey. It started over 20 years ago, a good 20 years ago. I used to write poetry, and I wrote because I loved writing, really, but I didn't have the faith in my own ability. I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't quite believe in myself 100%. But lucky for me, at the time, my mum did, and she sent off a poem to a competition, unbeknownst to me. The first thing I knew about it, I actually got a telephone call to say that I'd won. So that was kind of a pivotal moment in my journey. It was almost like the moment when Dick Whittington sets off to London to make his fortune. It was the start of something for me, because I actually believed, hey, maybe I could do something with my writing. So I joined a local writers' club, and I started writing, learning about the craft, learning about the publishing world, how to approach editors, the do's and the don'ts. And it really was, it was a learning curve for me. I basically cut my teeth there, I suppose you could say. And I started writing short fiction, and at the time I loved anything quite dark and grim, but also magical, a little bit like fairy tales. And so I started writing quite dark tales, and I got a bit of a reputation. They called me Spooky Alison at the time. And I built up a bit of a portfolio of work, got some stories published, and eventually got a publisher interested in publishing my first book of short stories called Small Deaths, which was, again, a really exciting, pivotal moment for me. But even better than that, I got an introduction from a writer that I really thought was wonderful, called Graham Joyce. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Graham Joyce, but he really is a fantastic fiction writer. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago. But in his introduction to my book, Small Deaths, he likened my stories to Grimm's fairy tales, and he said that they were dark and they were a little bit gory and disturbing, but also very enchanting. And that to me was the most wonderful compliment, being such a fan of fairy tales anyway. And also I didn't realise quite how significant that would be in the future, how much it would play a role in my writing career. Around the same time, I went to see a storyteller perform. Now, I have to say, this, again, was very key for me, because to actually see somebody lift the words from the page and bring them to life for an audience was really, really special. And I thought, I want to do that. I want to learn how to do that. So I literally threw myself in at the deep end, and I started storytelling. I started storytelling at events, in pubs, with adults, with children. And it really was quite a journey. Just like the fairy tale journey, really. There were highs, there were lows, there were disappointments, and there were challenges. But I learnt an awful lot. And I learnt a lot about the power of stories and how we can use stories and how they work for us. If you think about it, stories are inherent to who we are. And if we actually take the stories away from everyday communication, what we've got is a very dull exchange of information. And our ancestors were using stories thousands of years ago as a way of bonding, building an oral history, making sense of the world. So it seems to me that stories are such wonderful tools, and I kind of learnt this as I went along. and I started to develop my own workshops in storytelling, in particular in the field of education, using stories as tools to engage an audience, to deliver new concepts and new ideas. And through that, something quite remarkable happened, because although I was using the stories in the field of education with academics and teachers, I could see something different happening, something quite spiritual happening. They were telling these stories, but they were getting really empowered and feeling really confident. And there was a change. And it was one particular exercise that I did in my workshops, which was where I asked them to take a personal experience and turn it into a fairy tale that they could tell, that really opened my eyes to things, because they would take this experience, and it could have been something negative, something not necessarily, something that maybe had caused some kind of fear or phobia, and they would then retell it in the form of a fairy tale, bringing in the elements, the magic, the archetypes and the symbolism. And it would become something quite different, and it would become something positive, and you could tell that it was almost like a light switched on inside of them. And I thought, hang on a minute, this is really powerful stuff. Stories can be used in so many ways. And that, again, was another pivotal moment on my fairy tale journey, because I realised I can use fairy tales, we can work with these kinds of stories and transform our lives in the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we behave. And funnily enough, at that moment, I thought I would love to write a book on this. And it was almost like fate stepped in, and a publisher actually did approach me and say, have you got an idea for a book that you'd like to write? Because I'd written quite a few other books on magic and folklore. And I said, well, yes, I've just had this wonderful idea. I do a lot of work with storytelling, with traditional tales, with fairy tales, and I'd love to write this book. And they loved the idea, and they worked with me a little bit, but as with all things, as with all fairy tale journeys, things don't necessarily go that smoothly, and they had a few problems, they had a few financial difficulties, and several projects had to be dropped, including mine. And at the time, I was absolutely heartbroken. I thought, this is my baby, this is the one thing I've been working towards for years, and it was quite disappointing. But then I remembered, as in all good stories, the hero and the heroine, they always get to a point where they could give up. And they don't. They keep going, they're determined, they have resilience and tenacity, and that's what every writer needs anyway. So I thought, keep going, did my research, and I found Watkins, or maybe they found me, I don't know which way around it was now, but I have to say, it was almost as if everything fell into place. And I can honestly say that I do believe everything happens for a reason, because this book wouldn't be the book that it is today had it not been for the fantastic input from the team at Watkins and all the editorial help. And when I actually finally saw a copy of the book and had it in my hands, it was like that perfect fairy tale ending. I couldn't quite believe it. So it was a journey. I did go through lots of highs and lows, and I did learn an awful lot about storytelling. And I think that actually it benefited me going through that whole process, because although I was writing, and I was writing about lots of other things, magic, folklore, mythology, this was something that had to be based on research and personal experience and all of the work that I did over the years. So it actually happened at the perfect time. So it was the perfect fairy tale ending. Now, I don't want to go on too much about writing and the book and storytelling and bore you all. So I thought what I'd like to talk about the power of stories and how they can make you feel and how important it is to share those tales. And I'd like to tell you a story that is it's very special to me, because it was the first story that I actually created to tell to an audience. Up until that point, I would take stories that I'd written or had published and think, right, I'm going to perform them, I'm going to bring them to life. But this was a story that I decided I wanted to create especially to tell, to perform. And it's also special because it's based on a personal experience, something that actually happened to me, although there is a bit of creativity in there as well, as you will see when I tell it. And finally, it's one of my favourite stories because I like to think that it is a bit like a modern urban fairy tale. But of course you guys can tell me if you agree with that when I've finished. So I hope you enjoy it. It only happens when it rains. The crows, they come, they gather on the castle gatehouse, watching, waiting, counting the silences. Why do you think it is that they do that? I once asked him, and he shrugged, turned his face to the stars and said, why does anyone do anything in this city? But really, I said, what do you think it is that they're waiting for? He smiled and said, perhaps they're waiting for the king of the birds, the soul of this city, to take them on a journey. Perhaps. I never did quite understand what he meant by that, but then he always spoke in riddles. That was a part of his charm. I remember the night that I met him. How could I forget? The city was alive with the sounds of revelry, people out there having fun, and there was I in the midst of it all, except I wasn't really having fun. Not at all. And so, as the clock struck 12, I made my farewells and made my way out onto the cobbles of the lace market. So steeped in my own woe and my own thoughts that I failed to realise that I was actually on my own and at such an ungodly hour. Well, I have to say, they moved towards me, this three-headed monster. 3 drunken youths swaggering this way and that like a wall in front of me, and I remember thinking at the time, oh no, maybe if I kind of move to the right and I run really fast, they just won't notice me. But it was too late. They caught my scent. They moved forward and almost surrounded me, and I felt blocked in. I didn't know what to do, and it was at this point that a voice came from out of the shadows. Leave her alone, it said. For a moment, we all froze. It really was as if time stood still. And then the voice came again, and this time it sounded like 10,000 men. Leave her alone, it said. Well, I have to say, the three-headed monster needed no further persuasion. They were off as fast as their sleep-drunk legs could take them, leaving me standing there with my gallant hero. For a moment, we didn't say anything, and then I looked at him and I said, oh, thank you so much. And he just looked at me and said, it's okay, it's no problem, it's no big deal, really. So we talked then, and we talked for what seemed like hours. He had the soul of a poet, that one. And we just talked about everything, from the reason that he lived in the city, he lived on the streets, and how he liked to be close to the heartbeat of the people, to the rhythm of the city streets. But of course it was late and I had to go, I had to leave, and so I said goodbye. But each and every day that followed, I searched for him. I scoured those streets, but I could never find him. He would always find me. I turned the corner and there he was, like a gentle breeze, suddenly appearing silhouetted in the distance. We shared many nighttime tete-a-tetes, me and my gallant hero. And he told me many things, many fantastical tales. I knew they were fantastical. I thought they just can't be true. They really can't be true. He told me that the castle gatehouse was really an ancient witch turned to stone by an evil curse, and that even now she was trying to break free. He told me that the pigeons in the market square weren't really pot-bellied and useless. They were actually wishers clothed in feathers. And that to gain one, all you had to do was guess their name. So many things he told me, but he never told me his name. Names, he said, were like labels. They could easily be abused. But as with all things, fate has a way of turning everything on its head, and so it did with us, and in a heartbeat. I was working in the library. It was one normal Saturday morning, and I remember it well because in rushed this man, all red-faced and flustered, and he was shouting and he said, oh, you've got to come and see what's happened in the market square. You'll never believe it, never in your life. Oh, somebody's been stabbed, and oh, well, I think they're dead. You must come and see. It sounds awful. It sounds terribly morbid, but we did. Everybody filed out of the library and they walked down to the market square. But of course there was nothing to see, just crowds of people and police and that yellow tape flickering. But I knew I knew something was wrong. I could feel it inside. And later that day, when I saw his face, his features pale by the newsprint, I knew what had happened. He'd been trying to save the day again, playing the gallant hero, only this time it had been too much for him. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe he was gone. I couldn't believe that I would never see his face again, that I would never share in those enigmatic stories or see that smile. And I have to say, I cried. I cried for days, for weeks, for what seemed like forever. But then I had to stop. I had to breathe. I had to live my life because I know that's what he would have wanted. And you know what? I wouldn't be standing here at this very moment telling you this story had it not been for the other morning. What a glorious morning it was. The sun was high in the sky and the streets, they were still damp from the previous night's rainfall. They looked like silver rivers at my feet. And it made me think, I'm going to take a detour into work today. And so I walked past the castle gatehouse. And that's when I saw them. A dark, brooding army, a cluster of crows, and there, at the centre, with his arms outstretched, my gallant hero. For a moment, our eyes met in silent understanding. And then the crows, they began to lift and swirl around him like a giant tornado. And when I looked again, he had gone. But of course, now I know the truth. And I know the answer to my question, and I know who he is. And I also know that he cannot be dead. For how can the soul of a city die? It lives on, in the hearts and the smiles and the stories of all of the people. Thank you. I enjoy telling it, it's very powerful. And I think one of the reasons that I wanted to tell it tonight, as well as it being kind of linked in with stories and storytelling and fairy tales, is the fact that really, I guess it kind of embodies the power of stories, and they do help us connect and bond together, and they do bring alive that spark within us. And if nothing else, even if you're not a fan of fairy tales, if you go home tonight and you think about the stories that you share with others, the stories that you tell, and of course the stories that you tell yourself, because they're the most important of all. And maybe just share a story with someone, because at the end of the day, that's how you're giving part of your soul and bonding. So, thank you. How do I keep a story kind of powerful and potent after telling it several times? Yeah, well, for me, when I do that, what I have to do is I visualise the story, I see it in my mind's eye, and it's almost like reliving it again for me when I'm actually telling the tale. That's how I do it. It's almost like watching a film. I never have everything planned. I know how I'm going to start, I know how I'm going to finish, I know what the core message of that tale is and what it means to me and what I want to get across. But what happens in between is quite flexible, and it can be different every time. And you know, I have told the same story 10 times over, and it has been quite different depending on what I'm focusing on and what I'm feeling and what I want to get across. But that is part of the joy of storytelling. It makes it a little bit unique and a little bit different every time. What are my favourite fairy tales? Well, I always loved as a child, I have no idea why, well actually I've been thinking about this for a long time now, I always loved The Princess and the Pea. And it's a really simple fairy tale, isn't it? And for a long time it bothered me, and I thought, why do I like that? Because, you know, I like quite powerful stories. I like them when they're a little bit dark and light, and that's really quite simple. But I think what got me about that story was the fact that, you know, there was this girl, you know, on the doorstep, and they judged her by the way she looked, and they didn't actually take her word for it, that she actually was a princess. And they put her through this ridiculous test with a pea. I mean, it was very silly. It did work, and it proved the point, but to me, I just thought, you know, and it was all about judging someone on the way they look rather than, you know, we all have so many different levels, and I thought maybe that was it.
I don't know, I agree with you on that.
Don't you? What do you think? Do we have to be careful with the female role models? No, I well, there are some powerful ones as well. They're not, I mean, I think it's quite interesting because the characters within these tales, male or female, tend to go on a journey, and they may start off being rather foolish or appearing weak, but then perhaps they learn something along the way. And I think that we're all on a journey as well, and nobody's perfect, and I think that's part of the similarity that we can draw from this, and we can say, yeah, we're like that too. We all have disappointments, we all have challenges, and we have to, as the characters do, they carry on, don't they? They don't give up in the end. So I think we can learn an awful lot. Okay. I'm trying to think now. Put me on the spot. Well, I guess in particular, and I was talking to somebody about this. They were talking about having a character at work that was quite domineering and quite sort of bullying. And we looked at the kind of the fairy tale of Red Riding Hood and the wolf, and looking at things from the wolf's viewpoint, basically. I know it sounds a bit silly, but actually, we're all motivated by different things. And I basically said to her, sometimes if we can actually sit back and think of things from the other character's point of view, that will actually help us, even if we're never going to be friends. So, we can use these stories in that respect. Three Little Pigs. I always like that particular tale, and funnily enough, I mean, I've used that in education, which is slightly different, but I used that with one lady who was trying to get a point across to some students, and she was sort of saying, they're really not interested in putting all the effort in the real kind of basics of the rules and the regulations. These were students who were actually studying to work with children who had a lot of problems and issues. And she said, how do you get people interested? How can you use stories in that way? And we were talking about Three Little Pigs, and suddenly she realised, she said, oh, hang on a minute, I can see how I can use this story and how it relates in actual fact, because the first little pig thinks, I can't be bothered to kind of put the effort in, making my house nice and secure, the place where I live, and, I'm just going to kind of make it out of straw. It doesn't matter if it takes me 2 minutes, I'll cut loads of corners, whatever. And of course the wolf comes along, blows it down, and that little pig is left vulnerable and exposed. So the second little pig comes along and thinks, well, I know what I should be doing. So I'll kind of go half the way, but I'll still cut a few corners and, and see how it goes. And of course the same thing happens. Wolf comes along, blows it down, and he's left vulnerable and exposed. The third little pig thinks, hang on a minute, I've seen what's happened to my two friends here. I know it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of time, but what I really should be doing is putting in this time. And he spends all day building his house out of the bricks, so it's nice and secure, so that when the wolf comes along, it doesn't matter how much he huffs and he puffs, he cannot blow that house down. And more importantly, that little pig is left in a position of power to deal with the wolf. And we were kind of saying, that's an excellent example of how actually in life as well, with these students, you can show them how it is worth taking the time.